Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz and I'm joined by my fantastic co-host. He really enjoyed the offspring mechanic from Bloomborough because it gave him a ready-made excuse to start singing songs like Pretty Fly and Gone Away and The Kids Aren't All Right. It's Dana Roach.
I think this week we forgot to tell Matt to, hey, come out and play because it's just the two of us. But that was a good job, Joey, running the gamut of all the Offspring songs I actually know.
Yeah. Well, I'm really hoping that next time they come up with a mechanic called ABBA. You know, that's just my personal hope. We'll see.
That would be amazing.
Yeah. Dana, as you said, is the two of us on this week's episode. What are we talking about this week?
We're talking about what things you should be prepared for when you brew a commander deck.
Yeah, you suggested this topic, and I think it's really, really interesting because I think we do kind of have this like platonic ideal of like, what does a commander game look like in our heads? And then something happens in a game and you're like, maybe I should have thought of that. And so it's going to be interesting to go over the stuff that we did thought of that before we got into it and the stuff that we purposefully don't thought of that. Wait, does this make any sense? I feel like I'm losing my train of thought here.
I think we're on the same page here.
Cool. Yeah, really interesting. I'm excited to see what we get into, but we got some shout-outs to do before we move into that main topic.
First, we are very excited to be members of Team Ultimate Guard. Products you actually use are very easy to recommend, and we've been using Ultimate Guard sleeves and deck boxes for years. This fall, the three of us will be traveling to MagicCon Vegas at the end of October, and Matt and I will be at the Magic Summit a few weeks later. Now, there's some weird rules about what hobby equipment you can bring through TSA to check onto an airplane. For example, you can bring a bowling ball, but you can't bring bowling pins. But when it comes to Magic, you can bring everything. And Ultimate Guard sleeves and Boulder deck boxes will keep your cards safe when the TSA goes rummaging through your suitcase. And they'll also keep them safe from getting mashed together by all the bowling balls you're going to bring with you. At least that's what I'm going to be doing. So thanks in advance to the TSA and thanks in advance to Team Ultimate Guard.
Dana, on this show, we literally like, hey, maybe don't bring more than 6-ish decks whenever you're traveling, but you're packing 6-ish decks and bowling balls, plural?
I would be shocked if I only ever actually brought 6 decks to an event.
Yeah,
I may give that for advice, but I never follow it.
And if you want to help Dana be able to travel with all those extra bowling balls, you can support the show in a variety of ways. If you want to support us on Patreon, that means the absolute world to us. It is so fantastic to interact with folks on our Patreon Discord, for instance. There's also a ton of free ways that you can support the show. If you want to give us a like and a subscribe, that helps us out with the YouTube algorithm gods. If you want to leave us a review, that also is such a huge way for us to make an impact and get recommended to more podcasting platforms and things like that. All those various ways of showing your support for the show, they mean the absolute world to us, and they help us keep doing what we do. And we love offering different perks to our audience out there too. And one of those perks is the weekly patron shoutout. Dana, who are we shouting out on this week's episode, dude?
I went over the patron list from A to Z, and we found the name Ada B. So just at the very beginning of the alphabet, we chose patron supporter A to B. Thank you very much for supporting us, and thanks to all our supporters on Patreon.
That is terrific. Thank you so much, Ada. I hope that Bloomborough gave you some different bee cards to play around with, and maybe Miss Bumbleflower would count for a bee deck. I'm not sure, but I hope you were able to find some really cool stuff to brew there.
I think so.
Fantastic. And with that, I think we're going to be moving into our main topic here, Dana. Dana, you pitched this idea of what are the things that you should be prepared for, the things that you should be prepared to encounter in a game of Commander. To start us off, I guess, why was this on your mind? What made you want to suggest this as a topic to sink our teeth into?
The thing that made this at the front of my brain here was editor extraordinaire EK on Twitter made a post about people running Homeward Path and decks and how they should run it more often. And I just retweeted it because it's a really good point, and I run Homeward Path in a lot of my decks. It's gotten to be pretty expensive these days, so I understand why, it's not the kind of thing you just jam wildly into every deck, but I picked up quite a few copies when it was pretty inexpensive, and I tend to put it in almost any deck that has specific things I'm afraid to lose. If I'm playing a deck where it's just a go wide deck, I don't care for the most part if someone takes a few of my tokens or whatever, but if I have a couple specific creatures that I need to have in play, I want to protect them in multiple ways, but one of the things I also want to protect them from is someone else taking them and using them against me. So I tend to run Homeward Path in decks where I'm very concerned about someone taking specific things from me. And then just from that point on, thinking about that post EK made, I was like, well, what other things do we like really concentrate on preparing for when we build decks?
Yeah. I think that's a really great example. Like Homeward Path, as you mentioned, it's pretty expensive, which I did not realize. And it's showing up in about 2% of decks that can play it. But for an early challenge of stats, I mean, yeah, that probably could stand to see a bit more play because it's such a great way to counter someone's mob rule. Like, oh, you gain control of all the creatures and we're going to do an alpha strike? Right. It's a great counter against me with all of my animate dead nonsense. Oh, it took your creature? Well, it's back to me. Like, those are some really great uses. And those types of things, they do come up,
right?
But it doesn't feel in the deck building stage like the kind of thing you need to actively focus on. So it's a very easy thing to miss, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it's not the kind of thing that when I sit and build a deck, I don't, for the most part, worry too much about like what I'm going to do if someone takes my stuff specifically.
Right.
Because number one, you can usually counter that to a degree with anything that keeps people from targeting your stuff, right? Like a hexproof effect will usually stop someone from taking one of your things. So you can kind of do double duty there. What's nice about Homeward Path is it's not a dead card ever. Like if you don't use it for 20 games in a row, well, it's just a land making you colorless mana that doesn't come into play tap. Like there's no opportunity cost. So if you are playing a deck where you're worried about someone taking a couple specific things, it's a good little safety measure to run. And it is something I think about in those situations, because there's just really no downside to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's not the kind of thing that I think I make as much of a conscious effort to be prepared for, but it's the kind of thing I should. And that does beg the question about, like, what are some of the other things that we should be prepared for? And to start off, I mean, removal, right? Like, we just kind of like, of the top 10 cards in the entire format, 5 of them are removal spells. Like, we are all expecting a pretty significant deal of interaction from other players when we sit down and play this game. Like, Swords of Plowshares is one of the most popular spells in 62% of decks I can play it are playing it. And like a bunch of these spells are very, very popular. So like, I think there's a very reasonable expectation that we're not going to be able to get away with just whatever it is that we want to do.
People have always wanted to protect their stuff, but it's only been in, recent memory where we've gotten things that are really, really good at it. Not that there weren't ways to protect your stuff in the past. Lightning Greaves has seen a ton of play for a lot of years, but that also grants haste, same with Swiftfoot Boots. So like it does double duty. The one I think of, back in the day, there was plenty of like wrap in vigor type effects where you would give your stuff regeneration, or you could give it persist or whatever. The problem to me with those spells and why I never ran them was they felt too narrow. Regeneration doesn't do much good if someone exiles stuff.
Right.
It doesn't do any good if someone's going to steal your things. It doesn't do good if they're going to put a Darksteel Mutation kind of enchantment on it. It's only been in the last, 6-ish years or so we started getting the Heroic Intervention kind of protection effects that give Indestructible, that give Hexproof. Those stop, almost everything that isn't Cyclonic Rift. And that makes it feel way better to run them. You could run a Wrap and Vigor in a deck and never find a situation where it works. If you draw Heroic Intervention, there's almost always going to be a situation where that's going to save, even if it's just one single thing, it's going to save something.
Yeah. Entire games can turn on a dime when you have something, when you were prepared for people to try and remove your stuff and you stop them. Entire games can be completely transformed by casting a single Tamiyo's Safekeeping. Right. And just like, nope, I'm going to hexproof Indestructible this one thing, usually probably the commander, which commanders are powerhouses these days. And so your removal spell is blanked, and this lets me do my gross nonsense for even just one more turn. And sometimes that one more turn is exactly what gets you there. It therefore isn't a mystery to me that this shows up in 7% of decks that are eligible to play it. This is 136,000 decks are playing Tamiyo Safekeeping, and it's a $3 common. And there are, as you said, a bunch of different versions of this type of effect now across a couple of different colors. We've got the Tyvar Stand and the Blacksmith Skill. And I mean, the fact that this can save your commander is kind of huge. And so these are much more the kind of cards that I feel the need to like pack these in to be prepared for them. They're not necessarily exciting when I'm brewing a deck, and yet they keep my commander around to do the exciting stuff. So actually, it's very, very good. You feel so safe when you have one of these in hand.
Yeah. And now it comes to the single target things. Like, I would say if I'm playing a green deck, I can't think of a reason I wouldn't run Heroic Intervention. Teferi's protection is pretty expensive too. So like there's reasons not to run it. But like if that wasn't the case, if it wasn't a budget constraint, I'd be really hard pressed to not want to put it to various protection in every deck. Because like the situations where those two cards are very useful, there's just so many different times you want to have ways to like protect your whole board.
Right.
Tamiyo Safekeeping, I tend to take a long look at, are there going to be specific targets that folks are going to be focused on removing? And sometimes there aren't I have decks sometimes where I'm like, there's no one specific thing that's a problem. It's all kind of a problem together. So in that case, I probably wouldn't worry about Tamiyo Safekeeping. I've had that kind of mental dialogue with myself and decided I didn't need it in that deck. And I've also had that mental conversation where I'm like, yes, people are going to want to be removing these one or two things, and I should have multiple ways to keep them safe. Tamiyo Safekeeping being probably the first one I go to.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm playing red, for me, it's like Bolt Bend and Tybalt's Trickery to like redirect away a removal spell or just like counter some kind of thing as well. Like those little defenses, to me, I kind of almost count them as like an extra copy of my commander because it means I'm keeping my commander alive. And that is very, very important. Kind of related to this single target removal. Another thing that I feel I expect a lot more in games these days is stuff with ward. Yes. Stuff that has some inherent protection, not necessarily always hexproof, but maybe protection from a color or ward to make it a little bit more inconvenient to actually try and to deal with it. Is that a thing that you feel you have to prepare for in a game as well? And if so, do you do anything about that in the deck building stage to prepare for it?
I haven't really found a good solution necessarily yet for dealing with a preponderance of ward. I'm aware that it's something I'm running into more and more and more. I have not found something that I find to be a good solution for it just yet. They've been printing, things like can't be countered onto spells. It seems like lately that kind of gets around ward, since ward is in effect that would counter the spell. If you didn't pay the tax, it would kind of circumvent that. But that's not really something that I've found an adequate way to kind of prep for holistically in a whole deck. How about yourself?
There are a few other types of spells that I am playing around with a bit more. Soul Shatter, for instance, is one that I'm enjoying, which forces people to sacrifice their most important creature for, to kind of shorthand it. And usually that's going to be the thing with ward. And the fact that it also will hit multiple players kind of feels nice. Dana, I know you're a fan of Council's Judgment, which gets around stuff like hexproof and other protective abilities because it's about choosing a thing, not targeting a thing. And a big thing that I've heard from plenty of shows and that Matt and I have talked about a couple of times as well is just like, I'm playing more board wipes. Which is like, I mean, because, if stuff is going to be difficult to get rid of on an individual basis, then might as well get rid of the whole thing. And that, of course, has a lot of other after effects on like, well, if to kind of like, all right, let's test the wind here real quick. If I think that's the case, that like I'm going to play more board wipes to get around a preponderance of protection that is out there. Maybe other people feel that way too, which means we're going from like 2 rats in our deck to 3 or 4 or something like that. A bunch of board clears. Which means now I have to prepare for that too. Not only do I have to prepare for ward, I also have to prepare, all right, I should have a couple more keep my entire board safe spells in my deck to protect my whole board, because it does seem like the winds are changing towards people are going to pack a few more removal spells to try and deal with this thing. That's kind of a domino effect that I feel like I'm experiencing that I have to be prepared for.
Yeah, the addition of ward to like the larger Commander game as a whole has changed a lot of things kind of subtly. And we've talked before about, the ward 3s on things being kind of hexproof, particularly for the first half of a lot of games. Hexproof, at least you can there's a few things like the arcane lighthouse effects of the world that you can use to get around it, but there's not really a lot of options right now that really deal with ward, at least that you can run as an answer to deal with those things.
And I actually feel like that's an important part of the discussion is like Arcane Lighthouse is a really cool card to remove stuff like hexproof, and that can be a solution if you're running into some hexproof. But another solution is also just like find a different way of removing it too. And like that's kind of what I want this episode to encourage, is that like being prepared for it doesn't mean you find the one card that says the one thing. To take what is that card? I think it's called Confounding Conundrum, which like if your opponent plays more than one land in a turn, it'll bounce back to their hand. When that card came out, a lot of people were like, oh, this would be a great answer against landfall. And I don't think it is. I think that there are a lot of other types of things that you can answer against landfall. For instance, attack them before they get the chance to use all of their resources. That's a different approach. And it can be very effective to punish them before they get the chance to set up. That's what I kind of want this episode to encourage, is that there doesn't just need to be the one answer that is the obvious thing that says it exactly on its face. There are a lot of other very creative solutions out there.
Yeah, and actually, I'll say this: I haven't altered brewing necessarily because of Ward by adding like Darksteel mutation kind of effects, but they are pretty effective against Ward. One of the issues with Ward is, if you're removing a commander with Ward by paying the tax, it's just going to come back down and you will once again have to deal with it and pay another tax. Well, if you hit it with a, Song of the Dryads or something along those lines, where you're removing its effectiveness from the game, but you're not actually removing the card, you have to pay the Ward tax one time, but you prevented them from casting the threat again and like forcing you to deal with it, both by coming up with a removal spell and coming up with the extra tax mana. So there's been a lot of reasons I've been running more and more of those kind of like pin to the board enchantments, and frankly, they're actually relatively effective against Ward as well.
Sure. It kind of occurred to me, something on the board wipe stuff, like with more of those ways to protect a board, I guess to like kind of relay the logic out again. I mentioned, okay, there's more Ward, which means maybe there will be more Wraths. And if there are more Wraths, then maybe I want to have more of those Heroic Intervention, Selfless Spirit type of things to keep my board around. Mm-hmm. And that has also affected, as another part of the domino series there, that has affected which Wraths I want to play, because I don't want a straightforward destruction effect if there are going to be more of the Selfless Spirit type of thing. So I'm more encouraged than ever to play those Toxic Deluge type of effects, or something that exiles, or something that just straight up bounces. River's Rebuke actually has been making its way into a whole lot more of my decks, because it's like bounce all of a single person stuff, and I'm kind of like, dang, like if there's one archenemy, feels really nice to just like have a screw you in particular for the whole table to be able to get around that. Like that's the kind of form that I notice these things taking. And it's just interesting to see how those dominoes continue to fall in that sequence.
Well, and we just got, Dawn's Truce in white as another Heroic Intervention effect. And we've had things like Clever Concealment, and like we've had white's gotten a bunch more ways to protect their own stuff. And when it was just Heroic Intervention to deal with or Teferi's Protection to deal with, well, okay, if you're playing against those colors, you can kind of on your fingers count what the odds are, how many options they may have. That's not the case anymore. Somebody might entirely in a Selesnya deck have like 5 different ways to dodge your removal, and you need to like bear that in mind and maybe change your deck a little bit to prepare for that too.
Yeah. And I think that's just it. There is this very odd disconnect that happens like in the brewing stage. You're like, maybe this feels too situational. But then you actually get into a game and it's just like, thank goodness I have this.
Right. Yeah.
I had that reaction a single time with River's Rebuke. And it was like, oh, thank goodness, because a regular Wrath would not have done it, would not have gotten us, and it would have set other people back in a way that I actually kind of need their help to disentangle what this person is up to. Like some of those effects are kind of impressing me more and more. I'm like, oh, I wrote these off as maybe a little situational when I could be doing something that, for instance, affects all players and just sets me forward. But there are some of those extra uses that I feel like, oh, this opens up a very interesting pathway that I'm really enjoying during a game. And I'm glad that I gave them a chance, and I'm glad that I had them ready.
Yeah. Well, so let's get this one out of the way, because I feel like you've been dreading the conversation, this part of the conversation where we talk about graveyard hate.
We're just going to skip past this. It's fine. We can just move on to the...
Let's we don't need to tear this bandage off. We'll just like grit our teeth and get past it. So I'm curious about yourself here. As a graveyard player, though, even in your own graveyard decks, how much do you plan on dealing with other people's graveyards, aside from like maybe your plan is just to take their stuff out of their graveyard too? What is your level of preparation for graveyard hate?
Yeah. So my expectation when I go into basically any game is that whether they mean to or not, nearly everyone is indeed going to be playing some amount of graveyard interaction. I don't know if that feels reasonable to you, but it feels quite reasonable to me, given that, for example, I've just pulled up Eternal Witness here, shows up in 22% of decks that can play it. Now, that's not a huge amount of interaction. It gets back any card from your graveyard as a one-time ETB, but that's a really popular card. That's a really popular effect, and that can get them back even just a rogue Path to Exile or whatever, and that can be pretty helpful. And so if even just in small ways people are going to incidentally use the graveyard, then yeah, I want to be prepared for that. So I do pack graveyard hate against my opponents in nearly every deck that I play, even when I am trying to use the graveyard. Right. Because let me put it this way. I want to cast a Living Death, which will get everyone's stuff back from their graveyard, but I want it to be one-sided. I want only me to benefit from it.
Well, I double checked my decks before the show because I was fairly sure that this was true, but I did verify. Every deck I have, literally every one of my 22 decks, has a Scavenger Grounds, has an Abstergo Entertainment, and every black deck has a Pajuka Bog. So I have at least 2 pieces on lands, if not 3. A couple have Pit of Offerings, which is like a worse Pajuka Bog, and multiple are running the 2-color deserts that I could technically sacrifice to Scavenger Grounds and still have Scavenger Grounds around as an option. And I'm also running a handful of like artifacts that remove graveyards too, the Soul Guide Lanterns of the world.
How dare you?
And so I have some decks that like might have 6 or 7 different ways to deal with graveyards, and I still feel like I'm playing from behind against a lot of different decks that are graveyard centric, even with that many answers.
Oh, yeah. And Abstergo Entertainment's a really interesting one. I hate to talk about stuff that's going to exile all the graveyards. How dare you? But it is a really interesting card that has probably gone very, very overlooked. That's the new legendary land, taps for colorless, or you can filter a mana through it to get 1 mana of any color. But it also has 3 tap exile Abstergo Entertainment. Return up to 1 target historic card from your graveyard to your hand, and then you exile all graveyards. Not seen much broad adoption yet. It's from the Assassin's Creed set. It's pretty new, but it's probably still going to go relatively overlooked. But I think that that's a great way to like get a little bit of extra stuff before you actually do, nuke all of the yards.
Yeah.
But Scavenger Grounds, that's showing up in 155,000 decks right now, 4% of decks that are able to play it. Pajuka Bog shows up in like every black precon out there. It's showing up in 31% of decks that are eligible to play it. I anticipate that people will have an amount of graveyard hate, and I also anticipate that people will, in small ways, use their own graveyards if they can. And I mean, because you have to, because you can't let it run rampant.
Well, and one thing I do like about those cards too is they create a play counterplay scenario. Like if you have a Leyline of the Void in your deck and drop it, pre-game, or you've got a Rest in Peace and drop it on turn 2 or something.
Yeah,
you can kind of prevent a graveyard player from just doing anything unless they have an answer. I don't really enjoy that, as effective as it might be to win games. It also creates a dynamic that I really don't like, whereas I feel like a Scavenger Grounds effect or Pajuka Bog or something, at least it creates a situation where like decisions are being made and I have to like choose when I'm going to interact with that graveyard.
Right.
And I'm not shutting somebody off necessarily. They have an opportunity to do things, and they can like try to play around how much mana I have. I just think while those might not be as good as just blanking all graveyards immediately with, Leyline of the Void, I think they're maybe more fun and make for better games.
I'll yes and you there real quick. If you do a silver bullet, a thing that I've remarked on in past episodes that I'll bring up again here is that you are very effectively taking that person probably out of the entire game, which has the fun impact that you mentioned. But also, that person might not be the problem for the entire game. You might have another opponent who's an even bigger issue, but you've removed a potential temporary teammate's ability to help you out of that.
Sure.
And so there is sometimes not a huge danger, but that is a cost worth acknowledging that I think is important to note. And to go even further on that, if I'm constantly having to dance around your ability to, at will exile something with a scavenging ooze or something like that, you're forcing me into very tough decisions. And yeah, there are moments where you might make a mistake, but you're really forcing my gameplay to shape around a very specific thing that it feels like you have under an amount of control that you can maybe even politic a little bit. But like you are distracting me pretty effectively during that game as well. And that is also, I think, worth kind of noting. So I appreciate the fun aspect, but I also appreciate the strategy aspect that it opens up. Like you are actually kind of forcing someone to be on a little bit of a wild goose chase. And that's something that you can ease up some pressure when you need to and lay down even more pressure when you need to as well. And in addition to the fun, that's actually, I just think, kind of a cool way to like force enemies to behave in a certain way in a game that can be very much to your advantage.
Now, to come at it from the other direction, as someone who plays graveyard decks, do you like pack ways in your deck to deal with other people's graveyard hate specifically? Like, are you like, okay, I'm going to see a lot of ways to hit my graveyard, so I want to have maybe stifle effects or something, or do you just like roll with it?
This is very much a roll with it kind of thing.
Okay.
And to me, the reason for that is like, yes, I expect that people will mess in their graveyards. To me, in that case, you can't keep looking back. you have to just keep going forward. It's just like, well, okay, that's gone. Hopefully have removal for whatever caused it to make sure it doesn't happen again. But I just got to keep going. I just have to make sure the deck is full of enough discard or enough mill to refill the graveyard and just take another crack at it, because I have to trust that my deck is good enough with whatever it is that I happen to get in there. And the amount of time that it would take to reclaim whatever thing was exiled, that's just going to dilute my ability to make the strategy happen in the first place. And I think there are a lot of strategies that kind of fit into that sort of thing. So it feels, again, like the answer might be, oh, well, then let me use like those Rift Sweeper type of cards that will like take the thing out of exile and protect the thing that was taken away from me. But that's a very direct answer. And to me, it's not the correct answer. It's not the creative answer. And for me, the answer is to just be like, all right, yeah, that happened. Take it on the chin and let's move on to the next one and just keep barreling forward, because even if they had the answer this time, maybe they won't the next time.
Absolutely. Well, and sometimes you can also find yourself in a situation where, like, just incidentally, the strip mine or, demolition field that you're running to deal with someone else's Nykthos might also help you against someone else's scavenger grounds, or at least force their hand at an inopportune moment to have to crack it. And then you're like, okay, now I can focus on what I want to be doing.
Yes. Oh, man. Dana, I'm really glad that this talk about graveyard hate has actually not felt completely chaotic and awful for me. Thank you.
Right.
Because this is a topic very near and dear to my heart. Yes, it's a thing I'm prepared for, but let's never talk about it again after this. All right, cool. Yeah.
All right, that's fair.
In fact, let's go to challenge the stats now so that we can move as swiftly away from the talk of exiling my precious graveyard as possible.
Excellent.
All right, for our listener-submitted challenge to stats this week, I've got one of the trickiest rules challenges that we've ever seen, and it was submitted by our patron, Rodrigo Pimenta. And hey, buddy, hey, Rodrigo, thanks so much for letting us know about this one. Gear up, because this one is confusing. Let's talk about Breaker of Creation and how Hexproof From works in decks like Cathrol and Indominus Rex Alpha. So, Breaker of Creation is an 8-mana Eldrazi from Modern Horizons 3 with Hexproof from each color. It's in 7 total of the 3,000 Cathrol decks and about 34 total of the 3,800 Indominus Rex Alpha decks. And apparently, according to some very weird rules that Rodrigo let us know about, Hexproof from each color is a shorthand for 5 separate instances of Hexproof. There's rule 702.11 here, quote, hexproof from each brackets characteristic, end brackets, is shorthand for hexproof from quality A, hexproof from quality B, and so on for each possible quality the listed characteristic could have. It behaves as multiple separate hexproof abilities, end quote. Sort of like how Navineral Urborg Tyrant has hexproof from artifacts, and from enchantments, and from creatures. That's technically 3 different things. It's just compiled into one smaller text line. Breaker of Creation, therefore, technically works the same way. It's a shorthand way to communicate 5 different hexproof abilities, 1 for each color. And as you may know, Indominus Rex and Cathrol care a lot about your keyword abilities. They get huge bonuses if you find creatures with lots of keywords. They get a bunch of counters or will draw you a lot of cards for all those keywords. And when they refer to hexproof, they will count all forms of hexproof, including hexproof from. And on Cathrol's Scryfall rulings, it literally says, quote, if cards in your graveyard have multiple hexproof abilities such as hexproof, hexproof from white, and hexproof from black, a counter of each variant kind will be put onto a creature, end quote. So, in other words, Breaker of Creation represents 5 total counters for Cathrol decks and the ability to draw like 5 extra cards off of the Indominus Rex Alpha decks. And if you run this one, I'd say make sure that you get really familiar with these rules, because this is not immediately intuitive at all. Rodrigo, though, I think you're absolutely right that this card should see more play in those decks than just 7 and 34 total decks, respectively. Thank you for one of the wildest challenges ever. If you're playing Cathrol and Indominus Rex, give Breaker of Creation a look. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Yeah, that's the least intuitive collection of rules. I never would have thought it worked that way. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I'm still kind of bugging about it. Sometimes I still don't understand it, but apparently it works, so y'all give it a shot.
Literally, as you were saying that, Joey, I was DMing a friend of mine who has a Cathrol deck to to tell her the rule. So
nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
My challenge this week is for the card Well Rested from the recent Fallout set. It's an aura for 1 in a green. It says, whenever this creature becomes untapped, put 2/+1 counters on it. You gain 2 life and you draw a card. And this ability triggers only once each turn. Now, normally I wouldn't recommend an aura outside of like an aura-based deck, because those decks are usually planning on ways to protect a creature with a stack of auras on them. And outside those situations, it's usually a recipe to just get 2 for 1 by having someone remove the creature, and then you lose the aura as well. However, green has a couple of different creatures that you can put that aura on and keep them relatively safe, even if it isn't an enchantment-based deck. Thrun the Last Troll, namely, and Thrun Breaker of Silence both have different variations on hexproof. Thrun the Last Troll has Regeneration, Thrun Breaker of Silence has Indestructible, and basically this is an aura that you can put on that creature, lets you gain some life, lets you draw a card every single turn when you untap them during your untap step, and put counters on them to make them even stronger. It's a cheaper, better Phyrexian Arena that gains you life versus losing you life, and it buffs your creature. In a deck like either Thrun, where it's very difficult to remove, that's a really good repeatable draw every single turn that's also buffing your commander for only 2 mana. Right now, it's in just 2 of 666 Thrun the Last Troll decks, and just 300 of the 3,000 Thrun Breaker of Silence decks. So if you're running either of those commanders that have ways to keep people from removing them, Well Rested is a better Phyrexian Arena.
That's a really cool recommendation. I like that card a lot. Okay, Dana, so getting back into our main topic here, talking about other stuff that we anticipate seeing in a game of Commander, and do we prepare for these types of moments? We talked about removal earlier, and, we anticipate that people will have some pinpoint removal and stuff like that. But I think maybe we kind of breezed by some other, reasons that removal can be important. And it's because of big boards. We see a whole lot of big boards in play, but there's not just the you want to have a Wrath of God effect or whatever to deal with a big board. That's not the only thing I want to touch on here. I feel like another reality of a whole bunch of stuff in play can also be the fact that it creates board stalls. And to me, I feel like that's something that I also want to have something prepared for. And I'm wondering whether you feel the same way. Do you prepare for board stalls when you are brewing and playing?
I absolutely do, and it's not something I used to think about, although I admit I'm not sure if that's because the game has changed or if I just wasn't thinking about it 7 years ago. I just was I'll just make a bunch of creatures and eventually it'll work itself out. I think that might have been more it than anything, whereas today, if I build a deck and I'm this deck is going to win in the combat step, I am turning things sideways in some way, shape, or form. I am very conscious of the fact that that's not enough. I need to have some plan about how those creatures are going to punch through.
Right.
And in green, that's pretty easy. There's a Crater Hoof and a bunch of different Overwhelming Stampede variants. There's green, you just give them all trample, and there's a lot of ways to make that happen. In other colors, it's much trickier, and I'm always trying to figure out what that path is going to be for me depending on what colors I'm playing.
Sure, yeah. And I think one way that it manifests for me is a one-sided Wrath effect, destroy all non-artifact creatures when I'm playing an artifact deck, for instance, or I really like the cards stick together in my party deck, yeah, I'll only keep a party and everything else is going to go away. But there are a lot of other really interesting ways to kind of burst through those types of things too. I think Menace can sometimes be a little bit underrated, but that can really change the math and really muck up your opponents as well. But even having just a Rogue's Passage available to get through one particularly important creature, that feels more and more important as, we encounter a world of all right, a single Avenger of Zendikar makes a person nearly unhittable on the ground without some extra form of pump or evasion or unblockability.
Yeah, if you're playing blue, there's multiple different ways to give your stuff flying. I have a Dimir deck where I'm winning with wizard creature beats, and one of the ways I help punch those wizards through is there's different, a couple different wizards that give your stuff flying, or there's multiple ways I can put them all in the air. And that isn't always enough, but it's usually enough. A lot of times that is just enough to get enough damage for enough people that can work itself out in my favor. So any way to give any kind of evasion, I think, is very effective. And the one-side board wipes is a really good one, too. You mentioned that, but I want to come back to that just for a second.
Yeah.
We talked about Homeward Path at the top of the show here because that's a nice effect in that it's never dead. If you're not trying to save one of your creatures that someone's stolen, well, it's still a land that taps for mana, and there's not much downside to it. That's the same is true of those one-sided board wipes. Even if you're not using them to clear someone's board out so you can punch damage through, well, it's still a board wipe, right? You can still solve a lot of problems by having that. And cards that can do multiple things depending on the situation are really, really useful to have in a deck.
That's, again, to shout out River's Rebuke. That's the reason I've been enjoying that one. It's really great at helping me get through an enemy. It's just all right, cool. You can't block me because your creatures are gone. Reverse the Polarity is another thing I really like in blue. It's a great defensive thing to counter a spell if they were going to try and destroy my stuff. But then it also has the option of creatures can't be blocked. I'm all right, cool. Like, what a great defensive and offensive tool. I totally adore things like that. Those are so dang good.
I have an EDHRECast Salvage Splicer and Malcolm Kenai Navigator deck that wins via making a bunch of golem tokens and punching through. Glaring Spotlight, like despite the fact that I'm in green, I'm using Glaring Spotlight as one of the ways to get through in that deck. Number one, we talked about removing hexproof. Well, that is an artifact that does remove hexproof, but more importantly to me in that deck is I can sacrifice it to make all of my stuff unblockable, all those golems to punch through, and because of the way EDHRECast works, when you sacrifice an artifact, you put a +1 counter on all of your stuff.
Nice.
So in the process of swinging through with unblockable, I also buff my creatures up.
Yeah.
And I run that in my Gliss of the Trader deck as well because it's recurable. I can use it to give myself unblockable, and then when something dies, I can bring it back and use it again.
Yeah, I've got it in Karazakar because I want to be able to target people's stuff to goad their creatures with Karazakar's pinpoint goad ability. And it's nice to secure an Alpha Strike as well. Yeah. And I'll also say probably the most powerful mode of Galadriel's Dismissal, which can phase out all of a target player's creatures. That's a great defensive tool. Like, oh, if someone's going to try and rift, well, I'll phase out my creatures and I'm fine. Yeah. But also, there's also the offensive tactic where you can use this when you want someone else to be able to attack them, or when you want you to be able to attack them. Like, it's such a cool, or when they're attacking you, you're like, no, your creatures don't exist anymore. And by the way, watch out for my next turn. Like, right. Lord, that card is so versatile. But those effects feel very, very important because the board can get so crowded. Someone plays a single Hornet Queen and you're like, huh. what am I doing? How am I going to get through this?
Well, I mentioned that Dimir Wizards deck. I have multiple ways to give my Wizards flying, but like that doesn't probably do me much good if I run into someone's fairy deck or something, or their bird type deck where they're going to have all flyers as well. So I have Cover of Darkness as a backup in there to give all of my stuff fear. If I guess it wouldn't work against black fairies because there's a lot of black wizards in that deck, but like it's a way to like my eggs aren't all in the flying basket. I have a backup plan in terms of giving stuff fear or intimidation or something to get through too.
I mean, that's another perk that I like about like the mob rule or the Reigns of Power effects, which I really love. Yeah. It's just like, oh, this definitely breaks a board stall up too. Yeah. But I think there's also the ingredient of a board stall when it comes to like the Sphere of Safety and Pillowfort-esque abilities where it costs an unreasonable amount of mana to get through to a person if they have a bunch of those, propaganda-esque type of enchantments. So another thing about board stalls to be prepared for kind of just comes down to like backup plans, other ways to go a little bit higher to like just dome them right from the top. That won't necessarily involve attacking, but you're still going to get damage through anyway. I think that's also a pretty important ingredient when it comes to how am I prepared? What is my plan B? What are my backup plans are?
Keeping an eye on like diverse ways to punch through versus just hoping, not your one trick is going to work every single time.
Yes, yeah. There are still sometimes those moments where it's like, I wish I had direct damage instead. And that's why I like cards like Massacre Worm so much, where it's just like, all right, you've got a big board, but let me punish you for it. Because when Massacre Worm comes in, it's going to give a big minus, and you'll lose life for each creature that you happen to lose. And that direct damage can really, really add up. Rakdos Charm has got to be another. Like, Rakdos Charm can just straight up KO people because it can have each creature deal damage to its controller. All right, Matt, you've got 30 creatures. Goodbye. And actually on that, another card I've just recently added to my Go deck was Incite Rebellion. Dan, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this one. I think it was from like Commander 2013, maybe 14. It's a 6-mana red sorcery. For each player, Incite Rebellion deals damage to that player and each creature that player controls equal to the number of creatures they control. It's only showing up in like 2,100 decks or so. But if someone has a whole bunch of creatures, this can be kind of a way to like nuke them out of the game as well, because all those creatures are going to cause them to take a whole bunch of damage. It's symmetrical. It'll affect you too, but you know when you're going to cast it. And so if my pinpoint goading wasn't working in my pinpoint goad deck and someone's got a huge big board that I can't get through, well, that might actually be a liability.
The sudden spoilings and the polymorphous jest kind of effects where you just make everyone's creatures smaller or take away their abilities, those can be used in a tricky way, like you attack and someone thinks they have superior blocks and you turn their creatures into 0/2s and maybe you don't punch through that turn, but you wipe most of their board. Or if you do have the flyers and they have flyers back, well, you remove their abilities with those spells. Those have a lot of versatility in a lot of situations, and they can kind of function as, I think, fogs, which is what we're going to talk about next. They're not a perfect fog, but like making your opponent's creatures 1/1s reduces a whole lot of damage when it's swinging through towards you, and the versatility is very useful there. But even if they're not something that's that versatile, fogs are just really good in general.
I'm so glad that you brought up fogs. This is the thing that I'm packing more and more and more into my decks as time goes on. I started with like, kind of a one-off, maybe just an Ink Shield or whatever, and I'm like, nah, give me Ink Shield, give me Blessed Respite, give me Arachnogenesis, give a whole bunch of those. Feels so dang like. It's so secure. It's like having the Tameo Safekeeping to protect your commander, only this one's your life total at the late game point of the game where it matters. Because another thing I anticipate happening in a game is a freaking Alpha Strike. And it feels really good to basically time walk a person by saying, nah, your Alpha Strike doesn't do anything. Play Fogs. You gotta play. I don't know if I have a deck that doesn't have some type of prevent damage effect in it at this point.
And it's easy to get, because I've heard the comment from people that are like, I don't like Fogs, I don't want to play defensively. Well, it's not necessarily defensively. Yes, you're keeping the damage from coming in and hitting you and keeping you from losing in theory, but you can use those kind of offensively. You can like make a wild swing that you wouldn't otherwise make on somebody who thinks they're secure, and they think you are not going to swing in because of the crackback. Well, you can swing in. You can offensively kind of use that fog by swinging at a time you wouldn't normally swing, because you have one green mana that will defensively do what all of your creatures being untapped would have done. And even if you're not using it like in that method, well, when someone does an Alpha Strike thinking the game is over and you fog that, and then you kill them with your own crackback. Again, like fogs it's easy to get into the mindset that they're just an offensive spell, but like in a lot of ways they're not. In a lot of ways they are setting you up for an offensive attack either beforehand or afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Make a move that seems a little questionable to other people because you're sitting on an Ether Spouts, and then when they do send all of their stuff at you, their board is gone, or Settle the Wreckage, or a Selfless Squire. Like those are, as you said, offensive tactics, and it opens up a whole lot of interesting dynamics for you to be able to play around with during a game. And again, it just feels so freaking secure to actually have one of those. That is 100% a thing that I am anticipating is a really big late game play, because they can come out of nowhere. I've got my Thalisse deck, and if I get like 10 tokens in play, I could easily, my next move could be Moonshaker Cavalry, which might end the game by buffing up all of the creatures to a super lethal board state, right? Having a fog means that you don't have to fear that unexpectedness, even if it is the 1 mana version and you don't want to hold up a whole bunch of mana for the others. Like, it's a lot of security, because combat damage is one of the most popular way. Like Dana, we tracked our games, and I tracked it the way that my games ended. Combat damage was more than half the pie. Like, combat damage was a very common way that games ended. So it's really nice to have like a quick, no, don't need to worry about it in the late game kind of button in your hand.
One more big one, I guess I would talk about here, kind of tied in with the Homeward Path thing, is land removal lands. Especially nowadays with the addition of Demolition Field as a relatively inexpensive card. Ghost Quarter's been cheap for a lot of years. Tectonic Edge has been cheap for a lot of years. I mean, yes, Strip Mine is kind of the best version of that effect. Wasteland is really good too, but those are, in the $20+ range. You can get Demolition Field cheaply. You can get Ghost Quarter cheaply. You can get Tectonic Edge cheaply. And I honestly think like you should probably have 2, if not 3 land removal decks in most of your decks, because if someone lands a Nykthos or Field of the Dead or something, you're going to lose really, really often, just because of the sheer amount of mana they're going to make, or the sheer amount of like tokens that a Field of the Dead's going to make in the right deck. Those will keep you from losing games. And I really think you should have 2 or 3 of those in every deck if you possibly can.
I do agree. It's actually something that I need to get better about myself, because when you're in the brewing stage, it doesn't feel quite as prescient in your mind, maybe. Yeah. But Dana, I agree. No notes. It's something that I need to get better about in my own. Because when someone else slams the Nykthos, you're like, crap.
And that's the worst. That's like the least offensive thing is a Nykthos. We didn't even like mention Gaia's Cradle or the Sarah Sanctum that you might see against an enchantment deck or something that are that much scarier than even a Nykthos or something.
Yeah. Kind of related to mana stuff. What about treasures? Honestly, maybe we should have even brought up treasures earlier in the episode because of how truly prevalent I feel that they are. I can't recall the last game I played that didn't contain at least a treasure, Yeah. And so what do you find yourself doing about that? Because I have weird thoughts about this, because treasures feel peculiar difficult to actually properly punish.
Yes. The one thing I've been doing a little more of, I've been trying more often, is the Ratchet Bomb kind of cards. That you can play that will destroy something with a certain mana cost. And so like you can drop Ratchet Bomb for 2 mana, it's an artifact, and not put any charge counters on it, and then just sacrifice it to destroy each non-land permanent with mana cost equal to the number of counters on it. Well, in Ratchet Bomb's case, you would just blow up all treasures, and you're going to take out a lot of tokens too.
Yeah.
If a token is a copy of a thing, it will have the mana value of that thing, but like a lot of tokens are just a token, if not a copy of a token, that don't have a mana value. So like, I think the Ratchet Bomb and the Engineered Explosive kind of cards are pretty useful just in general against those kind of decks. But now that we've added treasures and clues and blood and, like all these different kind of go wide tokens that we see in decks, I'm leaning towards putting maybe one of those artifacts in all of my decks. Again, I just feel like there's enough different kinds of 0 mana value tokens in play that they're very rarely dead.
Man, this is again why it's so, like, I agree with you. They are very rarely dead. And I like especially that you're pointing out ways that they have utility beyond just treasures, because I feel like that's such an important thing for Commander players. You weren't playing Rapid Vigor, which can regenerate things, because there are other ways that your stuff can be affected. That has to be the same logic that we apply for dealing with treasures too. When you're trying to deal with treasures, well, they could sacrifice them all in response to your spell. Treasures can be used immediately, or they can be stored. They can be used in a variety of ways, and treasures can now be used offensively, like in your own EDHRECast deck, where sacrificing your artifacts will pump you up. There's a lot of ways to make them proactive.
Right.
And Commander players are very reticent to ever play a thing that is purely going to be destructive to an opponent, especially if it's a niche kind of thing that doesn't always appear. You can rely upon a Path to Exile. You'll always have a creature to hit, but you can't always rely upon when treasures will be there and whether the person with those treasures will be the threat in that moment. And it's hard to find. Like, it's 100 cards.
Right.
The density issue is also a problem. You might draw your answer far too late, and it just might not be as useful. So there are a lot of ingredients that go into how do you metagame against certain things like this, which makes Commander players kind of avoid them. I mentioned, actually, I asked a question to you and Matt a while ago about the card Sardy Adventure, if you remember that goblin. And I asked, hey, are you guys playing this one? Do you remember your response?
I think we said no because it's too likely to wind up dead, but I can't remember what I said about it. I don't play it anything.
Well, and so that's the main thing. Yeah, Sardy Adventure is a really, really cool card. It's a 2-mana Goblin Warrior, 1/1 first strike trample, but whenever it attacks, it gets +X/+O until end of turn, where X is the number of artifacts your opponents control. And whenever an artifact an opponent controls is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, Sardy Adventure deals 1 damage to that player. Really solid anti-treasure tech, and it's proactive. But what you and Matt both kind of mused on, each individually, you came back to me with some pretty similar answers, was about if I was playing like an equipment deck, for example, I want this to be a thing that is holding those equipment, it's holding those buffs. Or if you were playing like a goblin deck or a warrior deck, you want it to have ties into what the rest of your deck is doing. And that's an experience that I also have. I don't want to just play a thing that hates on treasures, like a Manglehorn, I guess, or whatever. I want it to have other types of threads or hooks back into what the rest of my deck is doing. I play Disciple of the Vault in my party deck, which also punishes people when artifacts go away. It'll make someone lose life. But I run that in my party deck because it's a cleric and I'll draw a card off of my party deck. So it needs that hook for us to actually get into it. And that's such an interesting behavior to observe about Commander players, about what we do prepare for and why we choose not to prepare for some of those things.
Yeah.
And just a lot of thought goes into why we can't sometimes metagame against these things effectively.
Yeah.
Because if we draw them and the problem isn't a problem yet, we still want to have enough forward momentum that'll make us the problem before we have to get to someone else being an issue.
I don't run Viridian Revel in a bunch of decks. As nice as it would be to draw a card whenever someone sacrifices a treasure, except for I do have it in my Glissa Sunseeker deck because Glissa's ability destroys artifacts, and I have a few different ways to do that in that deck. So it's pretty easy, even if people aren't cracking treasures. Well, I'm pretty regularly blowing up artifacts. There's a good bit of synergy there.
Yeah.
And I actually saw someone else play it against me this week in a Tuvasa the Sunlit deck. And I don't remember if they even drew any cards off of artifacts being destroyed, although they probably did. But they drew a card from casting it just because of how Tuvasa works. So in that particular deck, well, the worst case scenario was it drew a card, and maybe it did then feed something that cares about enchantments or, the Serra Sanctum we mentioned before or whatever. There's extra synergy there, so that makes that way easier running that kind of deck.
Yeah, we're so afraid to have a dead card. That's why a lot of the things that you've said that you really enjoy, like a Scavenger Grounds, well, it's still a land. It ain't a dead card.
Yeah, me especially. I very much am someone who, like, I love answers, but I hate answers that I feel are going to wind up not being useful.
Yeah, you've extolled the virtues of the card Extraordinary Journey. To kind of take a slight deviation here, Extraordinary Journey is a blue enchantment that can exile stuff that your opponents can still play those things that you exile, but it also says whenever one or more non-token creatures enter the battlefield, if one or more of them entered from exile or was cast from exile, you draw a card, and you can do that only once each turn. That's a terrific card. I, again, see so much impulse draw. I can't recall the last game that I played that didn't contain at least some amount of someone playing something from exile, whether it was Cascade or whether it was, Prosper effects with that impulse draw type of effect. So this actually triggers pretty regularly. But the decks that we actually see it played in are things that are themselves proactively casting stuff from exile, like Adventure decks or Cascade decks or things like that. And Dana, even you, the deck that you've got this one in, is one where you care about the blue devotion.
Yeah.
We are constantly trying to hook every single thread. And heck, Matt told a story on an episode with he and I a little while ago. I was trying to encourage myself to play the card Thrilling Encore in one of my decks because I like that card a whole lot, but I couldn't find justification for it. And Matt relayed a story of a similar type of card that he has in his Shanid deck, which cares about legendary things, and where he was playing a similar type of effect, Gerard's Hourglass Pendant, which is a legendary card that can also revive the dead creatures. But that one's a legendary thing, so in his Shanid deck, it's drawing him the card. Right. So like even that still has the thread, and that's when cards don't have those threads, those hooks into the rest of the stuff, it makes it very difficult for us to feel like, yes, I want to bring that. Even though when we wind up in games, we're like, man, I wish I brought that.
Well, it was as I was watching that episode, I was like talking to the screen because I have Throwing Encore in one deck, but it's in my Silumgar deck where, like, the way the deck works, attacking with dragons gives stuff -1/-1. Really often I'm like wiping a chunk of someone's board with that commander and another dragon swinging. Yeah. And it's really useful there. It's doing double duty. I can, number one, save my expensive creatures if something happens, or number two, bring a bunch of things back that died to those attacking dragons. So I was the same situation was there for me where, like, that's a really good card just in a general sense, but I'm greedy and I only want to run it in a deck where there's a bunch of different avenues for me to take advantage of it.
I love that you were talking to your screen, like you were there with us, with Matt. And
yes, like, listen to me, I have a point. Yeah, that's exactly what I was doing.
Kind of a weird jump to another thing here, Dana. I've got a question for you about things to expect in a game. Do you expect people to pay the one? Like the heuristic studies of the Esper Sentinels or any of those things, basically whenever there's a slightly inconvenient choice for everyone else at the table, do you expect any specific behavior that those cards will or will not elicit? What do you think?
I don't, in part because time has taught me you just can't tell. Like, I've sat at plenty of tables where every single person flatly rejects paying the tax, and I've sat at tables where everyone's very disciplined around playing around it. So I don't necessarily have an expectation, but I've also learned that those kind of tax effects, the worst case scenario is almost always just fine. Like, if everyone pays the tax, you're still probably getting enough value that you don't feel bad about paying it or about playing the card in the first place. Yeah. Obviously, Heuristic Study is a ridiculous card, and like, you could rationalize it in almost any deck. But almost any of those things that has some kind of a tax attached to it, I don't have any like preconceived notions about what's going to happen in terms of paying those taxes. But I always feel like it's whatever the answer is, whatever occurs, it's going to be to my benefit.
I feel like whenever I see one of those, do you pay the one type of effects like a Heuristic Study, there might be some amount of discipline for a short time, and then as soon as one person doesn't, the floodgates open. It's like a thing that I sometimes notice. And that can occasionally invite a little bit of criticism from other folks at the table. But again, we don't know what's in people's hands. Right. Like, it might be that, I actually want that person to get a whole lot of stuff in their hand because I'm going to punish them for it, for stuff like that. Who knows? But there's definitely an attitude, and I recognize this as well, that it does feel like people will focus more on proactively getting their own stuff ready, even if it is going to give a tremendous benefit to other people. And I can't necessarily say that that's always wrong either, because if you are stalling out against 3 opponents and you're not doing anything to keep one of those opponents from drawing a card, it's kind of like, well, what chance will I have in the game a little bit later against all 3 of you if I'm the only one doing this? It does kind of feel like I'm removing myself from that equation. Whereas potentially there's the ability that, like, okay, yeah, we all kind of leaned in and allowed that person to draw stuff, but at least now we're maybe set up, and them being the focus, having drawn so many cards is taking a little bit of the spotlight away from me. Right. That will give me a chance to potentially try and sneak in with something a little bit later game. Maybe there's a logic to it that isn't always just, bad threat assessment.
Well, the logic I've used in the past too, like particularly if you're sitting in like the third base seat where like the person to your left plays heuristic study and then everyone just doesn't pay the tax and lets that person draw cards as they take their turns and it comes back to you. Then you're like, okay, well, I can either lose the game by not playing enough stuff because of the tax, or I can lose the game and still play Magic. So I might as well lose the game and still do my thing versus like lose the game and not do my thing. Sure. Like I've had that thought process too before when no one else has paid their tax. Whereas when people pay theirs and it comes back around to me, well, sometimes I do the opposite. And I'm like, well, they've already put themselves back, and I can let this person draw one or two cards, and it's going to put me further ahead than the other two people. It's going to be worth I can offset that. So it's very situational, I think.
Yeah. And I think that there's like also, do you expect that people will play fewer draw effects when there's a Smothering Tithe in play? And I think in some cases, maybe, but like not always. That one's a lot, like paying the 2 on that is bizarre. And again, having nothing in hand to even try and find answers for it does feel like you're giving yourself so much of a setback. It's like, So that's again one that like, I think there are ways that people can lean in and it's just like, yeah, let that person be the bad guy, but hopefully that means that we'll each be set up and they're in the spotlight. It is tough.
Well, if you've been playing Magic long enough too, I guarantee we've all ran into that one situation where like someone plays a Smothering Tithe and then someone casts a wheel into it.
That has happened to me before and it wasn't great. Not gonna lie. So like, I'm not gonna forgive every like, instance, but yeah.
So, I mean, just like you can't predict human behavior sometimes. Like the worst choice will get made once in a while and you just have to understand that's going to happen on occasion.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's actually a kind of a way to say it. Like threat assessment or decisions that you don't understand necessarily, that's an expectation I have in a game as well, because that's what makes the game fun. And the fact that I think you're doing something that maybe looks weird is potentially something that I'll underestimate. Like, Dana, oh man, I thought you made a kind of a weird attack and you're kind of playing into someone else's effect over there. I don't think you should have made that attack. And I can be like, oh, in my head, bad threat assessment or whatever. And then I do what I think is an alpha strike and you Aether Spouts me.
Sure, right.
Because you put yourself into a position of looking like you were a little bit more defenseless than you actually are. So like those moments are still there. I don't know what's in your hand, but I do anticipate stuff I don't quite understand because that's what that game is.
Right. Yeah. I mean, whether it's a threat assessment or players, how they play, you can't prepare for everything. You just have to like accept the fact that like you are going to be caught unawares, whether it's because you just had no idea that this person was going to run an all theft deck and that one homeward path that you didn't draw isn't going to solve that problem.
Yeah.
That's just going to happen once in a while.
Kind of related to that, Dana. I mean, you just said you can't prepare for everything, and that's absolutely true. We do have to pick our battles, and we've named a few that we do or do not prepare for, as they've come up. Maybe one of us prepares for it, the other one doesn't, but these are generally a lot of things that seem pretty obvious on our minds. What are things that you are actively like, nah, it's not realistic for me to try and prepare for this. It would dilute the plan a little bit too much, stuff like that. What is one that you're very much like, not necessarily worried, or you'll just embrace it as it happens, do you think?
Kind of in a general sense, things that your colors can't handle. Like there's usually a colorless solution to most things. It's just an expensive solution. And once upon a time, I think I maybe used those as ways to solve problems. Like, well, I'm playing red and I can't deal with enchantments, so maybe I'll have a unstable obelisk in here, and something else that like in an emergency I can crack to deal with that. I don't really do that these days anymore. I'm like, you know what? I just accept the fact that like there's some things I can't deal with in this particular color combination, and I'm just going to lose once in a while. And I would rather lose occasionally to a thing that my deck can interact with efficiently than I would run a bunch of bad answers that are going to make my deck feel clunky a bunch of games. I'd rather lose once in a while with a deck that feels good than occasionally save myself but have clunky cards in my deck that I'm going to see pretty often.
Yeah. I really, really like that answer. And I'll actually say that, like, I've got a mono black deck where I've been on the fence about whether I play Feed the Swarm as a way to destroy enchantments. Because sometimes I'm like, well, maybe I can just move fast enough that it doesn't matter. Potentially that happens. I can player removal instead of needing to have a specific permanent removal. And so that's occasionally a choice that I will actively make. Not always, but like there are some reasons where I'm like, I think that actually this deck could move quick enough that I don't need to distract myself with those speed bumps when I could just like go straight to the dome. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I think generally a thing that I super don't anticipate, unless you're playing it like, the CEDH corners of the format, is when basically the only response to a problem ends up being some type of instant speed interaction, or like while something is on a stack. That was kind of the problem with Hull Breacher, right? Like it's so wildly efficient and cheap and all of these things at what it does that sometimes the only moment of proper interaction can be like freshly while it is on the stack, and that's not necessarily a realistic expectation. I do kind of expect like a different pace, I guess, than I usually see in my games at the version of the format that we're playing,
Yeah, like I have a friend that does play a lot of CEDH level Magic, and I've heard him talk about how he puts Otawara, Soaring City, into all of his decks because Otawara gives him a non-spell based way to bounce Thassa's Oracle.
Right, yeah.
And that's in that environment. Oh, that makes complete sense. If I was playing CEDH, I would absolutely be tempted to put that into all of my decks just as a way to interact with that really common win con. Now, I like Otawara and I run it in a few decks, but like it doesn't feel as important to me as someone who like isn't regularly worried about a Thassa's Oracle win as he is.
That's a really, really good point. Those are very, very effective, but like you can't bend your whole game plan around them to anticipate, well, what if they have this? Well, make them have it. I guess kind of has to be your answer in plenty of cases. I actually feel that way about the free spells like Fierce Guardianships and stuff like that. Like I can't worry every single turn about whether they've got a Force of Will. I just can't. Like, what if they have it? Well, then I guess they have it. But like, I'm already trying to do a little bit of math of like, oh, okay, they have 5 mana up. What could that be representing? But trying to do that when, okay, they have 0 mana up. Like I'm gonna turn myself into knots and distract myself a whole lot if I work that way in a game. So like I'll try and be as prepared as I can, but I cannot at all bend my entire game plan or the play I'm trying to make around the potential of a free spell. And I super will not put cards into my deck that are explicitly there just to punish those types of cards either, because that just doesn't feel like a realistic response necessarily.
I have Vexing Bauble in a deck, Vexing Bauble, that when a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, you counter that spell. I have it in a deck. In my Gliss of the Trader deck, where you can also sacrifice Vexing Bauble for 1 mana to draw a card. And in that deck, because there's so much artifact recursion from the commander, it's a 2 mana draw a card very, very frequently. That's the reason it's in the deck.
Sure.
And if it stops someone's Fierce Guardianship, well, that's great. Like the fact that it does double duty is why it has a slot, not that it just stops free spells.
Yeah. I think I'll also shout out a couple of effects like the Torpor Orbs of the world, stopping ETB effects, even Mind Sensors, stopping shuffling, Containment Priest, stopping stuff that wasn't like officially properly cast. Those are also like some very, very cool effects. And at certain competitive ends of the format, you'll most likely encounter them.
Sure.
But they don't tend to be the kinds of things that I feel like, oh, I got to have a game plan against these.
Yeah.
Those can be very cool, but I find myself, like, I look at those cards and I don't put them proactively into my decks because I'm like, who knows if I'll even draw these at the time where they would be necessary or appropriate.
Yeah.
And they, again, don't have in those decks all of the same hallmarks of like what you just named, of like, oh, those threads that hook into other stuff that makes it not always feel like a dead card. But I don't anticipate them, and I'm not going to necessarily feel like, oh, I got to play around them or I got to have an answer for this at all times.
Well, I do think a lot of this stuff too, when you get into the real specific stuff, I do think meta matters there.
Yeah.
We tend to go to big Magic events, and I play at a shop when I play that has like 120 people very often on EDH night. So and of those people, like a lot of them have, 10, 15 decks. I just can't metagame for that. The variety of decks I see both at like Magic Fests and Command Fests and playing at a large LGS, it makes no sense. Whereas if you are someone who plays all of your games with your 3 roommates, one of whom has nothing but a blue control deck and really loves playing blue, well, Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast look way better if you are playing in that kind of environment.
They do, but I'll also say that it's not the kind of thing that I feel I would always need to bend around either. Potentially there's a slippery slope there. If it feels like you're starting to metagame against your regular group, it can maybe sometimes start to feel like an arms race.
Right, absolutely.
In ways that feel a little accidental or unintentional there, and that can feel a little bit awkward of a conversation to have. I'll give an example for me of like a thing that I've just embraced. Like here's a meta example that I'm just like, yeah, it's just going to be the way that it is. I have that Karazakar pinpoint goad deck that I really, really like. You know, I attack people, I'll be able to goad their creatures. Buddy of mine has a vehicle deck. It's run by Greasefang. And you know what vehicles aren't for a good chunk of the game? Is creatures. They are only creatures for the time that they'd be able to suddenly animate and attack me. It is a bespoke weakness to my goad deck.
Sure.
Even if I cast a Disrupt Decorum, those things aren't creatures. Like, it is nearly impossible for me to actually goad my buddy's creatures in one of his favorite decks, which is full of all of these vehicles. And it's just not, even though I play against that deck regularly, it's just not worth it for me to try and like bend around that. It just isn't. Like I could twist myself into knots trying to undo that. But honestly, having such a personalized weakness to that deck, sometimes it's just fun. And I can find other ways of creatively trying to get around that. Maybe it involves, you know, being a little bit more careful with when I distribute my removal spells, saving them for him, or when I deploy my fog effects in that type of deck. Or maybe it just involves hitting him more before he gets a chance to hit me. I don't know. Like there are a lot of different ways around it, but I don't need to bend the deck around that particular thing. And it kind of is a fun piece of the meta now. It's a thing that I've just accepted is there, and it'll come down to the way that I play in the games rather than what I've brought with me in my pack, in my deck.
Yeah, no, I like that thought process a lot. I still think if I was in a really narrow environment, I'd probably be tempted to make a few tweaks to just deal with a thing you're going to see constantly. But no, it's a lot like that Leyline of the Void thing we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Like just having the push and pull is what makes things fun, and responding to people and letting them like try to shoot their shot and then stopping them, for me, it feels way more enjoyable than like just preventing them from doing anything.
Yeah, very much. And it again is like there are things that you can't even anticipate that could come up in a game.
Right.
There are things that come out of nowhere. There are things that you can see coming, and there are weaknesses of your deck that you should take efforts to shore up. But you're not going to be able to respond to every single one of them. And even if you've got them in the deck, you might not draw them at the right time. That's just a variance that is worth embracing in the game, so you don't have a whole bunch of like worry while you're playing it, and you can just focus on enjoying the stuff you were there to enjoy in the first place. So, Dana, thank you so much for bringing up this idea. I think it's great, and I think it's cool to see the way that we approach each of these different things and how we are or are not choosing to prepare for a whole bunch of them.
You bet. And once again, thanks to Editor Extraordinaire EK for popping this into my brain in the first place.
Yeah. You know, going back to the opening dad joke that we had, I feel like they also have to now make a mechanic called the Lion King, because this whole episode is just be prepared. Like that's... I will find dumb music dad jokes anywhere, Dana.
well played, Joey.
All right, listeners, we've got to hear from you about what types of things you are preparing for in your decks. What are the things that you reasonably expect to see in a game of Commander? And what are the things that you're choosing to be like, nah, if that happens, I guess I'll just deal with it, but I don't need to bend my deck around it. This is a fascinating discussion. I'm very curious to see what kind of things you guys prepare for that maybe we didn't mention. Definitely let us know in the comments. And with that, we're going to call this episode to a close. So, Dana, if our listeners want to get in touch with us, where is it that they can find you online?
You can find me online at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald, and you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me everywhere online at Joseph M. Schultz on all of the social platforms, and you can find the cast at EDHRECast everywhere online. And if you've got a question for us, you can contact us at edhrecast@gmail.com. Listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights, but until then, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.